Party coalition about whether this was anti-Semitism or whether it was legitimate criticism of the U.S.-Israel relationship, and also about whether Omar was being unfairly singled out. Omar's defenders note she didn't limit her comments about improper allegiance to Israel to Jews, and that many of the most prominent pro-Israel voices in the U.S. are not Jewish. They also argue that U.S. relationships with other controversial allies like Saudi Arabia are often discussed in such terms. Her critics point to a history of allegations of dual loyalty toward Israel being used as a pretext for anti-Semitic persecution, particularly in Eastern Europe. They say there is a specific context here that calls for a person like a member of Congress to speak more carefully. But others have a broader objection. Democratic Congressman Juan Vargas of San Diego, for example, tweeted, quote, "Questioning support for the U.S.-Israel relationship is unacceptable." Some members of the Democratic Conference pushed for the House to pass a resolution that would be critical of Omar's comments and reject anti-Semitism. Her defenders complained that she was being unfairly singled out, especially in an environment where anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim rhetoric has been a problem among the president's supporters. So the House took a broader route. They passed a resolution saying, quote, "Imputations of dual loyalty threaten American democracy and have no place in American political discourse." The resolution also rejected a wide variety of other kinds of bigotry, including threats against Muslims. The resolution passed the House with the support of all Democrats, including Ilhan Omar, and all but 24 Republicans. Liz, was Ilhan Omar's comment about swearing allegiance to a foreign country an anti-Semitic comment?
No, I mean, not in my opinion. I think that it's been a pretty difficult week. I'm not Jewish, and I've seen opinions split among people who are Jewish. You have some people like Corey Robin, Noah Colwin, saying they don't view the comments as anti-Semitic, as Seth Ackerman as well. And then you have some people who do. I think it's kind of hard to call. I think that what she was specifically referring to, the sort of restrictions on engaging in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is essentially a movement that would apply economic pressure to Israel, using those methods to get them to comply with various international guidelines regarding Palestine and settlements. And those anti-BDS restrictions have been placed on people who work for the government in some cases. I think that's what she was objecting to. She's been vocal about it before. I can see how that would be construed as requiring employees to have some kind of form of loyalty towards a foreign power. I think she was very careful in every statement not to say, I don't think she was being careful not to say it, because I don't think this is what she thinks. But I think it's worth pointing out she wasn't criticizing Jews or Jewish people. Even among American Jews, the opinions on American Israel policy are very deeply fractured. She was criticizing American Israel policy.
Rich, what do you make of that defense?
I don't buy that. I mean, it's very easy to criticize our policy towards Israel. You just say we're too supportive of Israel, or what Israel is doing in the West Bank is wrong, or Netanyahu is corrupt and should be toppled. No one have any objection to that. This is a criticism of Jews for having dual loyalty, and there are two things going on. One, obviously, there's history of this charge, and two, there's her history of saying that it's all about money, or Israel somehow hypnotized the world. So I think that this was not a good look for House Democrats. They crafted this resolution condemning all forms of bigotry just as a way to, as much as possible, sidestepping, condemning her in particular, and she deserved condemnation.
Kelly, what did you make of that pushback within the Democratic Conference, where it looked like initially there was a move toward a resolution that would have been more specifically about what Omar said, and there was a lot of objection to that?
Well, for starters, I think the unfortunate thing it says for Nancy Pelosi is that she's no longer in charge, clearly, because this is not the first time. I mean, we heard last week that there was pushback against moderates led by the sort of Ocasio-Cortez brigade. And so I think it makes Nancy Pelosi look weaker as a speaker to have this kind of further pushback this week. But what I would say, Josh, is I think this is a complicated controversy, and it's one of those that's sort of hard to get your arms around. I think part of why there was such a split this week is because it's one of those things where it's hard to sort of parse the language for people who are not in the know and have not been following or not as well versed in the stereotypes related to Israel and anti-Semitism. I guess an easier way to explain it would be that it's sort of like when people made gorilla jokes or watermelon jokes about President Obama. or his wife, it was very easy to get most decent conservatives on board to say that's out of the line, that's inappropriate, the person who said it needs to apologize, the person who sent the racist cartoon needs to apologize. It got tougher when you got into some of the more complex splitting hairs of racially coded language, like saying, he's lazy or he's intellectually weak. And so that's a bit of what this controversy was. The hypnotized Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. That was clearly so anti-Semitic that there was no other option except to see it that way and call it out that way. I think what's complicated about this situation is the average American is not well-versed enough in foreign policy to know why this was an unfortunate remark. My read is this woman has some anti-Semitic tendencies. Is a problem for a party that wants to call out Republicans and hold them accountable for every racist comment that Donald Trump makes. They need to hold their own party to the same standards, and this is, as Rich said, is not a good look. I would also say, however, that let's not forget that Representative Omar was herself a victim of anti-Muslim bias with that horrifying poster in the West Virginia Capitol. It shows that our whole country on both sides has some work to do, but I don't think Democrats can have it both ways and call Republicans out for not holding Trump accountable and not do the same on their own side.
I want to ask both Liz and Rich about something, because I think in this conversation we're seeing an inversion of something that we've seen in a lot of controversies between the right and the left over the last few years, which is essentially that you have people saying that comments like Omar's are insensitive and unacceptable because of a specific context around things that have been said and done to Jews in the past. And that the key issue here is not just having a freewheeling debate, but structuring the terms of that debate in a way that recognize the particular oppression that a group of people has faced in the past, and structuring your argument so as not to echo things that have been used in that oppressive manner in the past. And I guess the question for Liz is, why isn't that a strong argument that even if Omar's intention here you think was simply to criticize U.S.-Israel policy, that's a reason that the way she spoke is a problem? And my question then to Rich is, given that we understand that this is an issue here, are there other places where liberals have maybe had a better point than conservatives granted them about these sorts of concerns with regard to other groups? So Liz first.
So I mean, the question is, even if her intentions weren't anti-Semitic, if this causes some people to have the sense that something anti-Semitic has been said, shouldn't she back off of saying it? And my question is there any way she could make the substantive point she's made that wouldn't invoke these same feelings? Because, if what you're dealing with is a trope, any words can invoke a trope, right? The trope is just an impression that exists in the world.
But Liz, can I just say, though, part of this goes back to the point I was making about President Obama, is your standing and credibility on challenging and making a legitimate policy point is often going to be rooted in your credibility based on your history. And I think she has none. I think she's made such anti-Semitic comments before that it's simply no way for her to make this kind of credible type of complicated argument in a way that people are going to assume the best from her, which means that maybe this is not something she needs to be taking the lead on discussing at the moment. That would be my read of it.
I think that was the intent, right? Was to get her to not talk about it ever again. Yeah. I think that's the intent of most of these kind of allegations.
Rich, this is a form of political correctness, and I don't mean that in the pejorative sense of political correctness. Political correctness is basically watching what you say in order to be sensitive to the concerns that other groups of people who are different from you might have. And so, I mean, is this an example of where political correctness is a good and useful thing? And if people had a good point talking about politically incorrect things that Republican politicians, up to including the president, have said?
Well, I think you have to distinguish a couple things. I wouldn't support, chasing her from a college campus or having her assaulted or taking now millions of dollars for her to show up and speak someplace. But there is, basic comedy and good taste. And some of the examples that have been mentioned here clearly are blackface is something, it's not a crime against nature, right? It's deeply offensive because of the history. So I don't think most conservatives would disagree with that. They would just argue this tendency goes too far and gets into a ridiculous place. And then also there's a free speech problem on campus in part based on that.
Can we talk about the Republican objections to this resolution? Rich, why did 24 Republicans, why were they unable to vote for what I think, divorcing it from the context was a quite anodyne and inoffensive resolution expressing sentiments that you would think everyone could agree on?
Right, because they weren't divorcing it from the context. They saw it as a way to give a pass to Congresswoman Omar and didn't want to vote for it on that basis.
Liz, what do you make of that argument?
I mean, there was definitely a sort of dilution of the resolution that was just intended to discipline Ilhan Omar by turning it into a generalized resolution against hate. I think the whole thing was very stupid. And so, I mean, Republican reasons for opposing it were probably specifically to target Omar. And then Democrat reasons for trying to turn it into a more generalized resolution were probably some of the Democrats who were trying to protect her from sort of unfair censure. So the entire thing was just a disaster and a comedy.
Kelly, do you agree with that? Do you think this resolution was stupid, or have we gotten something useful out of this process?
I mean, speaking as both a woman and a black woman, which means I'm from two sort of underrepresented, disenfranchised groups, I don't think my life is any better today than it was before this resolution. So, I mean, I think this is one of those moments of politics as performance art. They wanted to say that they did something, took a stand in the face of this controversy. I think it just, again, was performance art that reinforced Nancy Pelosi capitulating as speaker.
I want to make it unanimous and say it was stupid as well.
We're all in agreement.
Let's take a break. I will be back with Rich Lowry of National Review, Elizabeth Brunig of the Washington Post, and Kelly Goff of the Daily Beast to talk about Paul Manafort. You're listening to Left, Right, and Center.
What do you think? Share your thoughts on today's show on our Facebook page or tweet us at LRCKCRW and download the KCRW app to listen to Left, Right, and Center on demand.
Hey, it's Ken White. 10 years ago, would you have thought that White House legal strategy would be a dinner table topic? Keep up. Every week, join me and Josh Barrow, hosts of KCRW's Left, Right, and Center, for LRC Presents All the President's Lawyers. We're here to help everyone navigate the legal dramas dominating politics today. Get it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
Back again with Left, Right, and Center. I'm Josh Barrow of New York Magazine. On the right is Rich Lowry, editor of National Review. On the left is Elizabeth Brunig, columnist at the Washington Post. And our special guest is Kelly Goff, columnist at the Daily Beast. Paul Manafort was sentenced on Thursday in one of the two criminal cases brought against him as part of special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation. Manafort was convicted of 8 counts of tax and bank fraud, and the federal sentencing guidelines recommended a sentence of 19 to 24 years. But Judge T.S. Ellis sentenced him to just 47 months, a large downward departure. In pronouncing the sentence, he remarked that Manafort had led a, quote, otherwise blameless life. Of course, Manafort is not otherwise blameless. After all, he pleaded guilty to 2 more felonies in another criminal proceeding related to his failure to register as a foreign agent representing Ukraine. He'll be sentenced in that case by a different judge next Wednesday, and he could get up to 10 more years. Liz, is this sentence sufficient?
I tend to think that financial crimes are not prosecuted often enough. I don't really have strong opinions about sentencing. I'm not sure what the point of the sentence is. I don't think he needs to be rehabilitated. He already knew what he was doing was wrong. So in terms of just retribution, it seems like you could get more out of him just by taking everything he has and redistributing it socially. I mean, I don't have a high opinion of really high prison sentences anyway. So I've found that kind of debate about should he have gotten more time, which he might, as you say, sort of uninspiring.
And I would note they have taken money from him. There's a $25 million forfeiture. Basically, Paul Manafort has been financing the Russia investigation. So thank you, Paul Manafort. Rich, what do you make of this sentence?
I don't make much of it. I think there are a couple things going on. I don't think that the judge was overly enamored with this case from the beginning. He seems to have the view that Manafort's basically caught up in this thing because he worked for the guy who won the presidency, and the prosecutor is after a bigger prize, evidence of Russia collusion. And he knows that Manafort is very likely going to get absolutely slammed by the judge in the other case next week. So a lot of people want Paul Manafort to die in jail, and that will probably be the likely outcome after he gets both of these sentences. But I just find the bloodlust over this really distasteful. The whole Russia thing was supposed to be, I thought, about getting to the truth of what happened in the 2016 election, and it's become just this drive for vengeance and to see people driven to the ground. Not he's an admirable person and he's guilty and it was a serious offense and she gets some jail time, but just the sheer zeal over seeing him die in prison, I think is as I say, is a little distasteful.
Kelly, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I don't think it's just about bloodlust. I think it's about an overall view about the disparities in our judicial system. I want to read something from Jennifer Rubin's latest column in the Washington Post, where she quotes constitutional scholar Lawrence Tribe, who said, "Judge Ellis's assessment that Manafort led an otherwise blameless life was proof that he's unfit to serve on the federal bench. I've rarely been more disgusted by a judge's transparently preferential treatment to a rich white guy who betrayed the laws in their nation." And I have to say that my read of this, I've written a lot about sentencing disparities, and not just when it comes to race, but about the fact that they're kind of a sign of what crimes our society treats seriously and which ones that they don't. And it's worth noting that there are pedophiles I have written about who've gotten less jail time than Paul Manafort just did. So just let that sink in for a moment. On the other hand, there are also African Americans who have been sentenced for drug crimes for significantly longer prison sentences. So I think that's why the sentence for Paul Manafort struck such a chord, because our judicial system is not fair. And we also know for a fact that there are sentencing disparities that fall significantly along racial lines, and I think that's why this struck such a chord for everyone.
I want to stick up for the idea that Paul Manafort's crimes were substantively really bad and deserving of a quite large sentence. I mean, the tax frauds were really large, millions and millions of dollars of taxes that he was supposed to pay that he didn't. That is stealing from the rest of us who pay our taxes and who expect services from our government. It's not just theft, it's a really large theft, and I think that's a large, important crime. The bank frauds were part of a broader effort to enrich himself by selling out to interests that were adverse to the United States. And I don't mean in particular in the relationship to Donald Trump, this very sleazy Ukrainian oligarch and political party whose interests were against the foreign policy interests of the United States. Paul Manafort became a rich man not through any legitimate business, but by doing things that added no value in society and actually were actively harmful to the interests of people. And he engaged in these illegal schemes as a part of that. The one thing I do want to note, on the other hand, in Judge Ellis's defense, and I didn't love Judge Ellis's conduct during this trial. I thought he made a lot of editorial comments that he shouldn't have. I would note that Ellis has been a broad critic of mandatory minimum sentence laws. So his view that sentence guidelines can be excessive extends beyond just white-collar crime. The issue is that for a lot of crimes related to drugs and violence, there are mandatory minimums which tie his hands. He cannot hand down a lower sentence even if he wants to, whereas he's allowed by law to give Paul Manafort this break. And then there is that issue that he's going to get another sentence from the other judge, but I would push back a little bit on Rich's comment about that the other judge is going to slam him, because what Ken White, who's my co-host on All the President's Lawyers, has been saying is that these two sentences are highly interactive with each other, and that it was likely that if T.S. Ellis had given a long sentence, that Judge Amy Berman Jackson, who will hand on the next sentence, would have made much of that sentence concurrent, which is to say she'd sentence him, but it wouldn't necessarily add a lot of years to the sentence. Now that T.S. Ellis went so soft on him, it's likely that she will just stack her sentence on top of that. So I think if she can give him up to 10 more years, I think that a sentence in the range of over a decade is a long sentence that reflects the very serious crimes that Paul Manafort committed. I don't think it was necessary for T.S. Ellis to go so low in order to achieve that goal.
Well, I think from his perspective, it's hard to know because he's not going first. And I think that was another thing. He's kind of annoyed that he wasn't.
Or he is going first.
Right. Sorry. He wasn't going second, I should say.
Right. Kelly?
Well, and can I just echo, too, on something you just said, Josh, which is I think one of the frustrations about some of the sentencing disparities that we've seen along racial lines is the fact that the argument was often made that crack cocaine and the selling of crack cocaine has a domino effect throughout communities. But the same can be said regarding white-collar crimes of this magnitude. And so I think, again, that's why people get frustrated, right? If someone sees a poor black kid who really felt like they had no other options but to do this for a living, and they say, well, you're destroying your people, you're destroying your community. Someone who had every advantage and privilege in life, like Paul Manafort, who really has no excuse, and yet there will be a domino effect for crimes like this, and yet it's not treated with that same scope or magnitude. It's like some people lost some money, our democracy was hurt a little bit, and I think, again, that's what causes people to not have faith in our judicial system.
Liz, I feel like this issue of white-collar crime is something that a lot of Democrats are turning to when they talk about crime. We've heard this from Kamala Harris in defending her record as a prosecutor, talking about how, crime does bad things to people and also drawing the connection to white-collar crimes and the need to prosecute those. And I guess the question is, does that reflect a good shift in government priorities toward these sort of white-collar crimes, or does it become a talking point to defend the existing judicial system that I think a lot of people on the left would say has been too harsh in general?
Well, it can go both ways, and I think that's one of the complicated things that Kelly is getting at here in the Manafort situation, which is that white-collar crime is under-prosecuted. It's not just that sentencing is a problem in white-collar crime. It's that there is so much white-collar crime happening all the time that just never gets prosecuted. And it's decisions that are sort of made in very complex areas of the government that are sort of unaccountable to the people. Ralph Nader had a really good article on this, actually, in Lapham's Quarterly called Land of the Lawless, and he points out there's just this vast quantity of white-collar crime going on all around us all the time that no one's ever held accountable for. And you saw that in 2008. You still see lingering resentment, especially among the left, over the fact that a lot of the bankers involved in the financial crisis never had any consequences at all in terms of being charged with anything. And then the other side of that, sort of separately, is the question of what our judicial system is for, how we should be using our penal carceral system, whether it's working, what outcomes we're looking for, and if we have even tested or have any idea what kind of techniques we can use to actually get the outcomes we want. And in that realm, the techniques and the responses we use for white-collar crime may very well be different than other types of crime, but it's such a mire and a mess of an issue with so little clarity that it's hard to even begin to articulate what symmetry would look like in terms of sentencing and punishment for white-collar criminals versus people who do, sort of ordinary workaday crime you think about when you think about crime.
I'm actually hopeful that this whole episode, with regard to the specific crime of unregistered foreign lobbying, which, sounds like a paperwork problem, but it really, people have a right to know established in the law, the extent to which foreign governments are paying people within the U.S. to be influential on their behalf. It's not just Manafort. We're also seeing these investigations related to major white shoe lobbying firms on the Republican and Democratic sides of the aisle, who were doing those sorts of operations for Ukraine. And I think that those efforts may actually be having an effect in discouraging this sort of white-collar crime, which had been endemic in Washington because it had been unpunished for so long. Speaking of crime and punishment, let's talk about the singer R. Kelly, who has been indicted for 10 counts of aggravated sexual abuse of 4 victims. Kelly was acquitted over a decade ago of child pornography charges, having convinced a jury, quite implausibly in my view, that he may not have been the person pictured in a video having sex with a minor. R. Kelly's outburst in an interview with Gayle King of CBS This Morning, in which he denied the charges, drew much attention this week. Kelly, what I'm struck by here is that the public has long had good reason to believe that R. Kelly had committed gravely immoral acts. But for a long time, the fact of the acquittal had allowed him to go on publicly in spite of that. And I think a lot of people are asking themselves more and more what their responsibilities are as consumers of artistic content to reject that content on the basis of the artist's behavior.
Well, so first of all, hat tip to Dreamhampton and her team for helping to push this issue forward with their film series, Surviving R. Kelly, and hat tip to Gayle King for doing a master class in what journalism looks like during her interview with him. I'm going to quote someone who's smarter than me, who I cannot remember who it is that said this to me. So if you're listening, feel free to tweet, I'm the one who said this to you years ago, Kelly. And what they said was essentially that no people, no artists are perfect. And so really the question we should ask ourselves as consumers perhaps is whether or not the person's missteps or crimes shape their work. And what do I mean by that, Josh? Well, what I mean is if Michael Jackson had a line of children's books, I would say they need to be yanked from the shelves. Or you take someone like Woody Allen, who says he didn't molest his daughter. She still says he did. We know that he married a woman who, for all intents and purposes, was essentially the equivalent of that relationship began when she was a teenager. He says that she was of legal age. We'll never really know. But what we do know is a lot of Woody Allen's work focuses on older men in relationships with young girls, starting with Manhattan, which is one of his biggest films. It's a 42-year-old male protagonist in a relationship with a 17-year-old girl. So I would think a decent human being should not feel comfortable airing or watching films like that, knowing what we now know about Woody Allen. On the other hand, I've written a lot about Roman Polanski for years. I was a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of saying that Hollywood should turn their back on him. I still feel that way. He's an admitted child rapist. However, I don't know that saying to students studying the Holocaust that they should never watch The Pianist because of what he did is particularly useful to our cultural discourse. George Washington owned slaves. I'm not comfortable changing the name of Washington, D.C. I think if we can show for a fact that the person's horrible behavior is not infused in their work, then I think that allows the work to remain an important part of the cultural conversation. I think when their bad deeds shape their work is when we should really take a step back and ask if that work should still be in rotation.
Liz, as I think about this, I feel like there's a distinction between artists who are living and artists who are dead, because I think one moral purpose of cancellation, if you want to call it that, is deterrence or accountability. You want someone like R. Kelly to know that their egregious behavior will hurt them professionally and financially, so it's just discourage people from doing that. Michael Jackson is dead, so accountability for Michael Jackson is impossible. So I don't see a moral point in shying away from his work. I also agree with Kelly's point that I don't see a particular harmful aspect of the work itself that would reinforce Jackson's bad behavior in his life. Is that the right way to think about it? And do we need a different standard for the living and the dead?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that all sounds right and fair to me. And I think that essentially the difference that you're latching onto when you say that there should be a different standard for the living and the dead is that, when an artist is still alive and they've done terrible things and you use their art or you engage with it, oftentimes you're rewarding them in some kind of way. So you're buying it, you're listening on Spotify, they're getting a little kickback for that, or you're buying the album, or you're watching the film in a theater and they're getting paid. And so I think that, the question is, am I actually sort of contributing to this person's, luxury? Especially when you have extremely well-paid artists who are very well-to-do. These are usually the ones that get quite a bit of coverage. Am I in any way sort of contributing to them? I understand not wanting to do that. I think that makes sense. But when the artist is dead and it's just their estate, I think that's a different case. The way I think about the art that's created by really bad people is I've gotten some really good advice from really bad people. And the art is sort of its own entity, and it can speak to you or communicate a point that, even though it happens to have come from a really bad person, is nevertheless an important message. And so that's what I try to think about in terms of sifting out when to go ahead and engage.
And Rich, another thing I've been thinking about this week as I'm thinking about this is that we've known the broad outlines of Michael Jackson's behavior since the early 1990s, long before he died. So in a sense, we ran out the clock here to a point where we as consumers did not have a moral obligation to shun his work. But it feels like that was, in a way, the easy way out. We should have been thinking about this much earlier. Yeah.
I mean, being a celebrity and a great artist, unfortunately, covers for a lot. I haven't watched the documentary and have no interest in watching it because the subject matter so stomach turning. But a colleague of mine who wrote a column about it points out there's a clip from news coverage of Jackson at the time, and he's waving to people from a balcony, and there's a small boy with him, and the newscaster said, "Oh, and there he is with his traveling companion." What did that mean? Like, everyone knew. It was like Harvey Weinstein times 10. Everyone joked about it. I was a teenager at the time, and when he was at his height, we were all joking about it, and he just got an enormous pass. And I associate with myself with all the remarks that have been made about the distinctions here, which I think are all very thoughtful. It ultimately comes just down to a personal choice. Are you able to get beyond the hideous moral character of the man who made songs that are quite wonderful and charming and have been, a cause of happiness for millions and millions of people listening to them around the globe?
I want to talk about a threat that is less real than some of the others we've talked about in this segment. You may have seen local news coverage about something called the Momo Challenge. The claim is that there are videos on the internet or text messages featuring images of this creepy Japanese puppet, and they're urging children to harm or kill themselves. I want to stress this appears to be an urban legend. The stories can't actually point to examples of children who have harmed themselves as a result of this phenomenon. People are getting scared about a thing that, as far as we can tell, is not actually happening. But the puppet picture is real, and it is scaring the crap out of parents and sometimes out of children who are seeing it on television news reports. In one instance, a Fox affiliate in Connecticut reported on Meriden police reassuring a child that they had arrested Momo. so that the child would be able to stop worrying and go to sleep. Liz, you wrote a column about this week and about what you think it reflects about the broader fears that parents have about not being able to control their children's environment.
Yeah, I think that's right. I have seen hundreds of hours of children's YouTube. We only have one TV in the house. We play the YouTube on the TV. The kid loves the YouTube, so everyone has to watch it. It's psychedelic. It's really odd. I've never seen anything scary or anything I felt was age inappropriate. I understand some of that content is out there, and I understand parents worry about, is there something that's going to somehow pass my recognition and slip into my child's life and cause them harm? And that's a really terrifying thought. It's a terrifying thought when it's a YouTube character. It's a terrifying thought when it's a priest you thought was a friendly family pastor. It's terrifying when it's family friend you thought highly of, and then it turns out things were actually very different. So I understand the anxiety. I think we're at a point where over promoting the anxiety. There have been several police departments and local TV affiliates, school districts that have sent out notifications, probably only heightening anxiety that need not be of concern. And I think that's also a problem of the internet age.
Rich, is this getting at something in the parental psyche about the way that society has changed, the role that electronic devices and screens have in the raising of children? And, the Momo isn't a problem, but is there a problem here that needs to be addressed that's bigger?
I don't know. I guess maybe it's a function, totally speculative, and just going off what Liz is saying, just parents now, at least a certain segment of parents, have such control and are obsessed with every aspect of controlling their kids' lives that any hint of something outside of your control happening, in the course of like a little YouTube video is terrifying. That's my guess.
Now it's time for Tweets of the Week. Sometimes it only takes 140 characters or maybe 280 to distill the spirit of the week. Kelly Goff, what's your tweet of the week?
I have a first runner-up, which is, all I will say is please visit Representative Rodney Davis's Twitter timeline to see his impassioned defense of Nickelback. But the actual tweet of the week will be from courtesy of the original Vaughn, who tweeted that a student came to class today with his child due to no babysitter or anybody to watch her while he was in class. My professor, Nathan Alexander, said, I'll hold her so you can take good notes. And there's a fabulous photo of Professor Alexander of Morehouse College holding this adorable baby girl so his student could take notes in their advanced mathematics class. I couldn't make heads or tails of the equations on the board, but it was a beautiful picture and tweet.
Liz Brunig, what tweet struck you?
So this is a demotic one because it goes to the crowd. Dozens and dozens of people tweeted this. It's a classic. I'm giving up for Lent.
Rich Lowry, what's your tweet of the week?
It's from a guy named Allah Pundit who tweeted about an exchange on Morning Joe with Joe Scarborough repeatedly asking former Colorado Governor Hickenlooper whether he considers himself a capitalist, and just over and over again he evades and won't answer the question. And the tweet is, hope this was worth the 1% of the vote he's going to end up getting.
My tweet of the week is from Gérard Araud, who is the French ambassador to the United States. He tweeted, quote, an involuntarily hilarious article in the New York Times style supplement, quote, when your kindergarten goes vegan, unquote. Every detail is a Manhattan-only gem. Except not every detail was a Manhattan-only gem because the kindergarten in question is located in Seattle. You would think that one would know that these sorts of hipster affectations can occur almost anywhere in the United States now. Kelly Goff, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
I've been talking with Liz Brunig of the Washington Post and Rich Lowry of National Review. We will be back to talk about Brexit. You're listening to Left, Right, and Center.
Join the conversation on our Facebook page or tweet us at LRCKCRW. Stream all episodes of Left, Right, and Center and other great shows at kcrw.com/podcasts.
Back again with Left, Right, and Center. I'm your host, Josh Barrow. On the right is Rich Lowry, editor of National Review. On the left is Elizabeth Brunig, columnist at the Washington Post. Next Tuesday, the British Parliament will vote again on the Brexit deal it overwhelmingly rejected in January. Prime Minister Theresa May issued a warning Friday morning. Approve this deal or else.
Next week, members of Parliament in Westminster face a crucial choice: whether to back the Brexit deal or to reject it. Back it, and the UK will leave the European Union. Reject it, and no one knows what will happen. We may not leave the EU for many months. We may leave without the protections that the deal provides. We may never leave at all.
May was speaking at a UK facility owned by a Danish energy firm, an example of the sort of business in Britain that could be harmed by a hard Brexit. To discuss what's next for Britain and to talk about some other issues in U.S.-European relations, we're joined by Amanda Sloat. Amanda is a senior fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution and is also a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School. Hello, Amanda.
Hello.
So I'm going in with the assumption that Theresa May is not going to get this deal passed, since last time it was rejected by 432 votes to 202. What can we expect in the likely event that Parliament does not approve this deal?
So next week actually sets up an interesting series of 3 votes. On Tuesday, as you said, Parliament has its second chance to vote on Theresa May's deal. And unless Theresa May and EU leaders are able to reach some sort of agreement over the weekend that is going to change more minds, it does look likely that her deal will fail on Tuesday, albeit by a less significant majority than the first time. Theresa May has then promised her members 2 additional votes if that fails. On Wednesday, there would be a vote on whether or not members are prepared to leave the EU with no deal, a hard Brexit. That is also likely to fail, since Parliament may not have majority support for any particular type of deal, but they don't like the idea of crashing out. The third vote, which will take place next Thursday, lets members of Parliament say whether or not they want Theresa May to ask the EU for an extension. And that seems to be the most likely scenario in the near term.
Liz, the Labour Party in the UK has changed its position. They now say they want a second referendum, and that would give Britons the option of staying in the EU after all. Is that the right move? You see in polls that most Labour supporters support remaining in the EU, but there's a serious left-wing critique of the EU as an essentially neoliberal institution.
Yeah, and there's also the Democratic critique, right? That if there has been a referendum and people voted to leave, and you still see polling that reflects an interest among, even, like you're saying, Labour voters among leaving the EU, then they should pay attention to popular sovereignty, right? If they want to be a democratic country. I understand that that's a problem for businesses and various vested interests, but if that's what the people want to do, then, I mean, I think you have to at least put up a pretense as a democratically elected government of responding to the popular will.
Amanda, is that right? Is it? I mean, because you hear this a lot from conservative politicians, including Theresa May, who had not supported a leave vote in the initial referendum. Basically, here we voted for this thing, now we have to do it.
I mean, well, the irony is that Jeremy Corbyn, who's the leader of the Labour Party, really has not until recently supported a second referendum anyway. He's a longtime Eurosceptic, actually is supportive of Brexit, and his preference would be to have general elections, become prime minister, and then negotiate a better deal. Some of the arguments that you hear for the second referendum, one is that there was a lot of misinformation that was given during the campaign, and so people didn't understand what they were voting for. There have been questions about Russian interference, and third, people will also say, you know, even aside from the disinformation, we didn't really understand what this entails, and now we actually see what a deal looks like, and so the people should actually vote on the practicalities. The biggest challenge is that there is not currently majority support in Parliament to move toward a second referendum. Even though all of the opposition parties in Parliament support a second referendum, there are more Labour MPs who would vote against it because they vote or they represent constituencies that voted to leave the EU than there are conservative rebels who support a second referendum and would vote in favor of it. So at the moment, the parliamentary math simply does not line up for a second referendum.
Rich, is this the key problem with populism? That, you know, there were a lot of critiques of the EU. I even think a lot of them were good critiques of the EU, but there's nothing here about what the alternative is to the existing arrangement with the EU.
It wasn't well thought through. Theresa May isn't a big believer in Brexit to begin with, and is kind of inept. And then the EU was determined to make it as painful as possible for the British to avoid any follow-on effect and anyone else daring to try to get out. I doubt they will actually crash out without a deal, but there's some chance of that, because if you had a vote and whether they're going to crash out without a deal, it wouldn't pass Parliament. But the thing is, you need something to pass Parliament to avoid crashing out, and it's not clear whether any of those things have a majority, but I would still put my money on a delay And I think if there's a delay, there's some significant chance that Brexit never happens.
So, Amanda, what happens with the delay? I mean, first of all, they need permission from the EU in order to delay their exit. When they gave the notice almost 2 years ago that they were going to leave the EU, my understanding is that's binding, and you need the other EU countries to agree to waive that and grant the extension. Is that going to happen?
Yes, I think it is likely to happen. You're correct that when the EU triggered Article 50, which is the provision that starts the divorce negotiations, that started nearly 2 years ago, March 29th, 2017, which has led to March 29th of this year being the departure date. Theresa May is scheduled to meet with her fellow EU leaders at a summit the following week, so March 21st and 22nd, and it is expected that at that summit, if not before, depending on how Parliament votes, that Theresa May would ask for an extension. You're also right that all of the 27 other EU member states would need to agree to that extension. The question is going to be how long the extension is and what the extension is for. Certainly, we're going to see a blame game start if there is not a deal resolved, and I think EU leaders are going to want to be seen, at least in the first instance, as being helpful rather than punitive. But at the same time, they are not going to want to have a series of extensions simply to facilitate more political wrangling in London. The other practicality that we are going to run up against is the European Parliament is scheduled to have Europe-wide elections at the end of May, with a new European Parliament scheduled to sit at the beginning of July. And so if you start to run past a short technical extension, it raises questions about whether Britain is going to stand members in the European Parliament election. If they do, are you going to have protests for those candidates in the election, and what does this mean for the constitution of the European government and political appointments that have to come out of that heading into the summer and fall?
Liz, this feels to me like one example of something that we've seen all over Europe for the last decade plus, which is basically political crises where you lurch from one thing to the next and you have big ideas about transformative policy brought up by parties to the left or to the right, and then you mostly end up with a muddling through. Even in Greece, which elected a far left government, I don't think they have tremendously changed the situation for Greece in terms of public policy. So what does this say for aspirations in the United States for big transformative change when we see the great difficulties that have been encountered in Europe?
Well, I would say in the United States, we have had transformative policies before, and the kinds of policies that are being proposed by the left candidates in the United States do seem sort of different in measure and kind because the United States has no history of a really successful far left movement. The policies that you're seeing are not actually that radical. They match policies that already exist in countries of similar development. So Medicare for All, for example, some of the child care proposals that have come out, these are actually fairly modest in terms of what a country with our development can afford and can deal with. And so, I mean, I think that what these sort of muddling through episodes demonstrate is that, sort of neoliberal forms of governance and capital have a very strong grasp on governments across the world, and that they can very strongly resist in ways that are not democratic, but are not accountable to the people, change that's requested through popular sovereignty. And if we want to get a hold of that and actually retain control of our own destiny as a country, then part of that is reining in those capital interests.
Rich, do you see a parallel in terms of the sweeping rhetoric from Donald Trump and the relatively modest actual policy changes that we've seen under him?
Well, yes. Maybe it's a different phenomenon just because our system is geared toward making large-scale change difficult and requiring a real super consensus to do it. I think that the big question for Democrats, if we're looking at the prospects of them winning the presidency and perhaps controlling both houses of Congress, is what to do with one of these aspects of our system that's really ingrained now, which is the filibuster. And surprisingly to me, given how kind of inflamed the Democratic Party is and how aggressive the left has been and how it's really driving the debate, you've had some of these senators who are on really aggressive things. You know, the Bernie Sanders Medicare for All, they would eliminate private insurance, or the Green New Deal, not being forthright and saying they would eliminate the filibuster. So they don't eliminate the filibuster, none of this is going to happen, and it's going to be they'll only be able to do incremental changes.
I do want to talk about one very large U.S. policy change that the president has apparently at least been talking about. We will see the extent to which any of it is implemented. This is a report from Bloomberg News this week, which says President Trump has become fixated on a concept called cost plus 50, which is to say he wants to demand that countries that host American troops, like Japan and South Korea and Germany, pay the cost of those troops doing their operations in those countries plus 50% for the privilege of having those American troops there. Trump tried to make this demand of the South Koreans unsuccessfully in some other negotiations with them, and now he is at least pushing to take it global, according to Bloomberg, although like a lot of foreign policies, this has been encountering significant internal resistance within the administration. Amanda, what does a demand like this mean for the U.S. relationship with NATO allies in Europe, and particularly for Germany, which has this very large U.S. military presence?
If this policy actually goes forward and a request is put to the Europeans along these lines, it's going to be extremely problematic. I think it's based on a faulty assumption of why the U.S. has bases in these countries. The main reason that the U.S. has bases in South Korea and in Turkey and in the U.K. and in Germany and Japan and these other places is for our own national security interests and our own strategic interests. That is the primary reason why we are there. There certainly has been concern in European circles over the last year or two about what sort of stance President Trump was going to take on NATO. He certainly has been very hardline on defense spending, the desire for more burden sharing, which is something that previous presidents of both parties have called for. But what has been more troubling has been his reluctance, it seems, to affirm American commitment to the Article 5 collective defense commitment. And with this type of request could potentially be a way of undermining NATO unity and American solidarity with NATO by a backdoor financial request.
Liz, it almost seems to me like the president is thinking about the U.S. military as though it were a mercenary force, not taking a view on whether it should be abroad or brought home, but basically if people are willing to pay the right price, that it can go there. And I think that's part of what he likes about the Saudi relationship. He sees it as financially beneficial in a way that he does not see the relationship with some of these other, frankly, less controversial allies.
Yeah, and I think that he was more or less explicit about that, even in the campaign phase, running the United States like a business. And he has been deep in that rhetoric with every other kind of obligation or commitment the United States has internationally. The UN, for example, saying that, other people aren't paying their fair share and we're giving more than we're getting back, and it's a crappy deal for us. And if you want us to come to the table and engage, you're essentially either going to have to pay us or at least make it a good deal for us in some kind of tangible way. And I think that, oddly enough, that's part of his appeal. And when you think about how, sort of powerful the language of deficit hawkery has been in the Republican Party, you can see why, for a lot of voters at least, that would be a pretty compelling explanation of American involvement in foreign affairs. It should be a good and beneficial deal for us.
Rich, it seems clear to me that the president has a very negative opinion of NATO. There are things that he would like to do that would greatly undermine the alliance, and what has helped conservatives sleep at night is a feeling that he's not going to succeed at those because the bureaucracy is going to stop him. Do you feel confident about that in regards to this matter as well?
I don't know. I don't know. It's nerve-wracking. It's foolhardy. And this is one of the great strategic advantages we have vis-a-vis our main competitor, which is China, China is just nakedly self-interested. They come in and give you a loan. They're going to take your port, for a 99-year lease when you can't repay it. And because of that, it's really difficult for the Chinese to build coalitions and have allies the way we do. So we shouldn't be turning around and trying to gouge our allies. And I take the point and totally agree with it that this is, these arrangements ultimately serve our self-interest, but that we're willing to play well with others and there's a certain beneficence to American power is a huge strategic advantage to us, and we'd be kicking it away for a pittance. Whatever, if we actually succeed in this policy, any additional money we get would be a relative drop in the bucket. So I don't know what's going to happen. I certainly hope he's talked out of it.
And we're going to have to leave it there. Amanda Sloat, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We've reached that time once again for our famed left, right, and center rants featuring pet peeves from across the political spectrum. Liz Brunig, what's your rant?
I don't want to name names, and I don't want to get too much into scolding specific tweets, but I will say that if you're a very popular politician who's caught on with a younger audience and you rely on your social media to keep in touch with your base, that's a good thing. but you don't need to put out an official statement on everything. And in fact, tweeting about stuff before a situation has actually developed fully can be pretty detrimental. So just don't feel like you have to tweet every time something happens. No one's going to come ask you where your tweets are. Don't worry. There will be further occasions to tweet.
Rich Lowry, it's your soapbox.
It was a widespread trope during the border wall fight that Trump was, quote, manufacturing a crisis at the border. Now we have the latest numbers for border apprehensions in February, which were at the highest level in more than 10 years and largely made up of Central American family units that, because of our various rules, we basically have to let into the country. You don't have to believe that Trump's border wall is a solution at the border to realize we have a problem that should be taken seriously.
For my rant, a thing that is apparently problematic this week is food culture. Is the veneration of home cooking and so-called slow food putting an undue burden on working moms and lower-income people who don't have time to cook? Are the sensible people the ones who eat the same thing for breakfast and lunch every day for efficiency and simplicity? This was an argument in The Atlantic. This food fight reminds me of the great Oakland egg spoon fight of 2018, the controversy over whether one should cook a single egg as Alice Waters does, held over an open wood fire with a $300 forged iron spoon. Who was problematic? Was it the people who recommend this labor-intensive and expensive cooking method that is impractical for the masses? Or was it the people who came after Waters and her iron spoon, even though they don't bother all those men with their expensive sous vide machines? Too often in society today, we seek consensus where none is necessary. Cook at home or don't. If an iron egg spoon made by a local artisan makes you happy, good for you. We don't need to agree on these things or even discuss them that much. And we don't need to preen about what our food choices say about us as moral actors. That's all we have time for today. I want to thank Rich Lowry, Liz Brunig, Kelly Goff, and Amanda Sloat. Left, Right, and Center is produced by Sarah Fay. Our technical director is JC Swadek. Katie Burskins and Colin Cab Washington are our production assistants. Todd M. Simon composed our theme music. I'm Josh Barrow. Thanks for joining us, and tune in next week for more Left, Right, and Center.
Download and subscribe at kcrw.com/LRC, the KCRW app, or wherever you find podcasts. Left, Right, and Center is produced and distributed by KCRW.
globalcommunityradio.blogspot.com, the place to go for all things GCR. From there, you can find program schedules for all 3 GCR streams, view a list of GCR partner stations, learn how you can support GCR, get in touch with GCR, and keep up on all the latest GCR happenings by reading our blog posts. All that plus much, much more at globalcommunityradio.blogspot.com, globalcommunityradio.blogspot.com.
Monsters could be living under your child's bed or in the bathtub. For a child with asthma, it can seem like monsters are everywhere. Because something as innocent as a teddy bear could trigger their next asthma attack. But there are simple ways you can help, like putting stuffed animals in the freezer to kill dust mites and drying bath toys to prevent mold. Learn more at noattacks.org or call 866-NO-ATTACKS, because their next breath is in your hands. Brought to you by the EPA and the Ad Council.
This is Global Community Radio, Channel 1, News and More. Portions rebroadcast on KFZR-LP, Fraser Park, KIEZ-LP, Monroe, KLQS-LP, Agua Dulce, KPDO, Pescadero, WLRI-LP, Gap, WMUU-LP, Madison, WRAQ-LP, Angelica, WXDR-LP, New Orleans, and WXIR-LP, Rochester.
From Feature Story News in London, I'm Ollie Barrett. Both black boxes from the Boeing jet that crashed in Ethiopia on Sunday have been recovered. The Ethiopian Airlines 737 MAX 8 digital flight data and cockpit voice recorders have been recovered from the crash site close to Addis Ababa. A number of airlines have grounded their MAX 8s after the crash, which came only months after the same model of plane came down in Indonesia, killing 189 people. All 157 on board the Ethiopian flight en route to Nairobi were killed. Negotiations between the EU and UK continue despite little progress during the weekend. Brexit talks remain at a deadlock, even though UK lawmakers are set to vote again on the divorce deal on Tuesday. FSN's Europe correspondent Kevin Ozebek has more from Brussels.
The weekend ended with a Sunday night phone call between Prime Minister Theresa May and European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, but their talk did not cap off a breakthrough of any sort. The UK negotiating team now has just about 24 hours to try and bring home an amended Irish backstop. That's the part of the divorce deal many Conservative MPs can't stomach because it could potentially keep the UK locked into EU regulations in order to ensure the border on Ireland stays open. EU leaders have maintained for weeks there is little to no wiggle room for amending the backstop. If UK MPs vote down the deal, they will then vote if they should block a no-deal Brexit. If that happens, they'll then vote again to decide if the Brexit process should be extended. Kevin Ozebek, Brussels.
An inquest has found that Prodigy vocalist Keith Flint died as a result of hanging. The 49-year-old musician was found dead at his home on the 4th of March. UK correspondent Natalie Powell reports.
A post-mortem examination into the death of Prodigy singer Keith Flint found the provisional cause of death to be hanging. The inquest into his death has been adjourned until the 23rd of July, while the coroner awaits a toxicology report. But the singer's death has been confirmed as not suspicious. The singer's band had released a new album in November and were due to tour the United States in May. Natalie Powell, London.
North Koreans have voted in parliamentary elections